Okay, I came across a video. It kind of came up on my recommended list, and the video is entitled History Debunked. Um, I'm always a little wary of videos with those sort of titles or those sort of channel names because they sound like conspiracy theories, and I'm always wary with treating conspiracy theories as facts. But the video was about the Barbary slave trade in North Africa. Um, So that's one video I watched. Another video, which was kind of taking another angle, also connected to the subject of slavery, was from um, Home Team History, I believe is the name of the channel. And that video was taking as the young guy reading it claimed the fallacy of black people selling black people in the transatlantic slave trade. He was coming very much from a black nationalist sort of perspective, and in my opinion, and I've left this comment on his channel, the fallacy is in his downplaying of that factor in the transatlantic slave trade. So I'll come back to the first video in a second, but whilst it's fresh on my mind, the second video, by the way, I should say, is from 2016. Both videos have roughly the same number of views, about 300,000 views. Um, so his opening argument, the young guy in the second video, is that at that time there was no idea of black African among African peoples. The idea was an alien concept. So there was and is hundreds of different ethnic groups and religions in West Africa. So he was positioning the argument that you can't say it was black people selling black people because they didn't have that concept. And he made the interesting comment you can't judge it by 21st century standards. Now, this is interesting because he then went on to take very much a position of it's just narrative they want to give, talking about people who say, well, what about black people who saw black people? Now, he was making the false insinuation that that is the overwhelming theme of debate about the transatlantic slave trade, i.e., sort of whataboutery, but it isn't. It really isn't. If you consider the transatlantic slave trade, it's a very, very documented event in history. There have been dozens, hundreds, thousands of films, documentaries, books, commemorations in a lot of different forms. So it is a very, very well documented event. And the idea that the argument about black people selling black people is a major theme of that is nonsense. The overwhelming focus is on the evil white European slave traders who, brought Africans and forced them to work on plantations and so on. Three prominent films: Amazing Grace about the abolitionist William Wilberforce, Amistad, and 12 Years a Slave. They all focus on the European side of it predominantly. Certainly in the case of it's been a while since I've seen Amistad, but certainly in the case of 12 Years a Slave and Amazing Grace, they're entirely focused on the white racist slave traders. I would argue there's been minimal attention paid to the African side of things. And when it is brought up, it's just dismissed as, oh, well, white racists wanting to make excuses for it, even though it's not an excuse, it's just an aspect of the slave trade. That's the point. It was a trade. It was an evil trade, but it was a trade nonetheless. Um, Now, the first video was focusing, like I say, on the Barbary pirates who operated roughly between the mid 16th century and the mid 18th century. And the problem apparently was so bad, and I must admit I was pretty ignorant about this. I'd always known that there was a problem with Barbary piracy in that part of the world, on the high seas, but I didn't know the extent of slavery as a practice. Um, and I thought, okay, well, I won't just go by this video, do a bit more research. There's a Wikipedia article on it, and there's other information online. You can look this up. Um, but thousands of men, women, and children, white men, women, and children, white Europeans, were sold into slavery by Islamic North Africans. Uh, the Barbaries were operating as sort of Ottoman vassals in that part of North Africa. And the conditions were horrendous. In some cases, men were forcibly made into eunuchs to serve their masters. There are old prints of this stuff. Um, I thought, well, is this like a conspiracy theory? Did this really happen? It did. That's the sad thing. It really, really did. And the figures, I'm not going to put out any figures because I don't have that information available. But the figures were not small. We're not talking about just a few thousand people. This went on for years and years and years. The problem was so bad that apparently in some communities in Spain, entire communities were abandoned because of the fear that this caused. So how did it end? It ended because the British government, apparently, of the mid-18th century, so this I assume will be the governments of the Duke of Newcastle, Henry Pelham, people like that. They basically paid off the Barbary Pirates, a sort of tribute, basically say stop harassing us, stop kidnapping our people. Um, so why is this being ignored? Slavery has existed throughout human history. The Quran and the Bible are riddled with references to slavery. It existed in antiquity. Certainly, the Romans and various Greek states used it. Existed in ancient Egypt. Um, and the Arab slave trade was far more prolonged than the transatlantic slave trade. So why, when it comes to slavery, is a almost entire focus on the transatlantic slave trade? I'm not downplaying it. It was a major event. Millions of people were involved in that. But why is that the sole focus when we talk about slavery? Um, the young guy in the second video, is decrying the generalization of black people, yet he pretty much endorses the narrative of collective white guilt. I mean, he makes the point we don't talk about the Romans enslaving other white Europeans in the same way as among the white people, so why talk about it among the black people? Fair enough. But he is also making the proposition, he's very much endorsing the argument of collective white guilt. So that's a contradiction. You can't say, oh, well, don't talk about the black African slave traders because you can't generalize all Africans. Yeah, there were many tribal groups, ethnic groups, religions, languages. That's still true today. In fact, ethnically speaking, West Africa is one of the most diverse parts of the world. They say there's more ethnic diversity in terms of DNA between West African groups, I should say, and East Africans than there is between a white European and a Chinese national and Chinese person, such as the diversity of the African continent. So that in itself is a valid claim. What is a contradiction then is to say, well, because they were diverse, you can't talk about black people selling black people. You can't judge it by 21st century standards. Yet it's black nationalists and the likes of Black Lives Matter that are constantly pushing the them and us narrative. It's Black Lives Matter that is constantly pushing, we demand reparations from the white people. They're the ones pushing the them and us mentality. They're the ones pushing the black versus white issue. The reality is slavery and evil practice that has existed throughout human history is not as simple as black versus white. It's just not. That's been part of it in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, but it's only one part of it. So when are we going to start focusing on other aspects of slavery? The rampant problem of the Arab slave trade, the slavery that existed in the early Islamic conquests is another example. In fact, and I haven't studied this, I should stress, there are charges that the Prophet Muhammad himself kept slaves. Now, I need to double check those sources, but that has been an allegation. Muslims would staunchly deny that or downplay it. I think it's plausible because that was quite normal for warlords of that period. And Muhammad was a warlord. He didn't spread Islam peacefully. So that is a very valid issue, at least to look at, at least to debate. Slavery today is a rampant problem. You know, as recently as this year, there have been photographs of black African slaves in Libya being sold as human chattel. These are repugnant images and just as shocking as anything you would have seen on a plantation in the 1850s. And yet that gets scant attention. When these black identitarians associated with Black Lives Matter are constantly pushing the demands for reparations and white guilt and all the rest of it, they turn a blind eye to this stuff. So my take on slavery is let's purge it from the world once and for all, wherever it exists. Focusing on the transatlantic slave trade, which ended in the British Empire in 1833, we're talking 180 years ago, more than 180 years ago, focusing on that whilst basically ignoring slavery today seems to be ridiculous. It would be a bit like making a pacifist argument and talking about medieval warfare whilst ignoring armed conflicts today. So I think it's time we had a lot more honesty when it comes to historic issue of slavery. And far from the transatlantic slave trade being ignored, that seemed to be the only one that's spoken about. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be spoken about. It was a major event. But there is a great deal of hypocrisy from those who talk about getting white reparations and all that sort of thing, whilst ignoring the fact that slavery still exists in the world today. And some of the worst offenders are African states, Mauritania being an example, Libya being another example. So, I mean, you can find this in intertribal conflicts as well. For example, with Native Americans, there are many examples of slavery from one conquered people to another, both before and during European colonization of the Americas. That, again, gets ignored. Why? Because it doesn't fit into the narrative of let's just focus on the evil white Europeans taking over and killing everyone. To be clear here, I'm not a revisionist. I'm not saying that the transatlantic slave trade should just be ignored or the culpability of racist white colonialists should be ignored either. Not at all. I'm not saying that. I've never ever made that position and I wouldn't make that position. All I'm saying is let's look at the whole scope of history. If we're going to focus on these things, let's not just focus on one and totally ignore others. And it's not whataboutery, it's valid. It's valid because these things are still going on today.